are at the Hatch Street Studios in New Bedford's North End with sculptor Erik Durant. Mr. Durant is a part of the figurative turn in art. He has a number of very interesting sculptures, some around the city, and a lot in his studio right over here. Mr. Durant, show us what you think is important.
Thanks for stopping by the studio. I appreciate you coming and taking the time to look at my work and give me an opportunity to show some of the things that I've been doing. I figured I would kind of get started by just talking about a little bit about my process and how I move works up sort of and down, and some of the different scales. To answer your question in terms of which ones I think are important, well, I'd probably have to say that as an artist, whatever I'm working on presently. So
yeah.
All artists struggle with talking about things they did 2 or 3 years ago.
A musician told me that once.
Yeah. I'm always most interested in the sculpture that I'm working on at that moment in time. Presently, I'm working on a life-size monument of Elizabeth Tabor for the town of Marion. There's that project. Plus, I'm also working on a number of smaller works that are part of my body of work that I'm always exploring. So, and some of those are in preparation for a show I have coming up in May at the Katuitt Art Center. So I'm working on a whole bunch of new pieces, part of my Bound Captive series. So.
Take us through some of these.
So here we are actually taking a look at one of my small gesture sketches. This is Daedalus. This one is cast in bronze. So this is one of a group of gestures that I've been getting cast recently. They're an important part of my process because the gesture sketch is the place where I mine for ideas. So
tell the audience who Daedalus is.
Daedalus is a figure from Greek mythology. He's most well known, I guess, as being the father of Icarus. Things didn't go entirely well for him all the time, and he's a particularly sort of tormented figure. And so this gesture here is really just sort of trying to explore that feeling of torment and guilt and some of the things that some of us go through. All in gesture, though, with the movement of the figure. So that's what I'm going. So
it reveals a whole universe.
Yeah. Well, for me, with the gesture studies, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sell the narrative with the movement and the motion of the figure entirely. So one of the reasons, there's always questions about why are the figures in the nude and things of that nature. Because when the figures are in the nude, you have to sell everything with just that movement. So he doesn't get extra accoutrements and things that tell you who he is. I'm relying on the position of the body in order to tell that story. And that sort of forces me to put that into the figures. So these figures are actually, if we take a look over here, these are some of the gesture sketches that I've done over the past year or so, and there's more of them around. But basically, usually about once a week, I have a model come in and we work on different poses. And I use those poses to do different things. So a lot of times these poses become something that's larger. So some of them just stay as loose sketches. Some of them I work up a little bit more and they get cast in bronze and they become part of the official sort of gesture sketch series. Other ones are getting blown up. So actually, this is a figure I'm working on right now. This is a half-scale figure, so you can see how much larger it is in comparison to these. This started as a gesture sketch. I don't have the gesture sketch for it right now, though, because that gesture sketch is at the foundry getting cast currently. But this was a loose sketch initially, and now it's getting blown up into something larger. So I actually work in a number of very specific scales, either 1/6 scale, which is what this is. This is 1/2 scale. Some of the other figures, if you look around, are 1/3 scale or even 1/4 scale. And then ultimately, the largest size that I work on is life size. So people are sometimes surprised to learn how much math is involved in the process. So when I say that the figures are 1/6 scale, they're measured out exactly at 1/6, because that's what allows me to scale them up into larger things.
Can you tell us the meaning of some of these things? There's very different, odd sorts of meanings here.
So a lot of the figures are my own sort of recollection, or recollection isn't the right word. They're my own thoughts on different stories. So, for example, we're taking a look over here at Theseus and the Minotaur.
Yeah.
So Theseus and the Minotaur is a classic narrative from Greek mythology.
That's from the Labyrinth?
So the telling of the story, as it's sort of read, is that the Minotaur lives at the center of the labyrinth, and he's a devourer of children. There's a lot to the story and how it's sort of read, but Theseus enters the labyrinth in order to find and slay the Minotaur. It is my thought that the literal interpretation of it, as if there is some actual physical labyrinth, as if there was an actual beast that was half bull and half man. That literal interpretation, I don't think that the Greeks ever truly believed that. To me, the story of Theseus and the Minotaur is about the mind, and the labyrinth is a metaphor for the mind. And Theseus enters into the labyrinth in order to slay the darkest thing that's at the center of it. So, whereas most people see them as two separate characters, I see them as the same character. The Minotaur represents to me the darkest thing that exists in our own mind. And you go into the labyrinth in order to defeat that thing. So this version of Theseus goes into the labyrinth as I would, nude, exposed, carrying not a bronze sword, but instead the .38 revolver from my father's side drawer that probably hasn't been shot in 20 years, with a couple of shells that maybe still work but maybe don't. That's what I would bring to this fight. The idea that he would be wearing gold armor and everything, that's not the way it would be in my mind. So
that's an interesting take on it, perhaps subjective. Not sure what the Greeks thought of it, but I know obviously they were doing metaphorical works.
But it's when we read stories, are we supposed to interpret this story as history, or are we supposed to see it as metaphor?
Metaphor, of course.
And so that's how my mind processes that metaphor.
I mean, they would use history as a metaphor for something. Why select this part of history rather than that part of history?
Well, and that's always that's one of the sort of interesting things about doing monuments to the past, is that a monument to the past is more of a reflection of what the people who are making it are thinking than what the people who lived at the time when it was, that's memorializing. So I think that the things that we choose to make are reflections of the culture that we live in at this moment in time.
Dominantly, yeah. I mean, there are artists who can go against the culture, but for the most part, yeah.
Yeah, and I think even the notion of going against your culture is a context of your own culture. So there's we live at the time that we live. As much as we might want to look at some other period of time or be nostalgic for another period of time, we are here and now. And so even if we're thinking nostalgically is a luxury of that many of us have based on our circumstances. So that's how I would think it.
You don't think man has an independent mind? You think man is trapped in his culture?
Huh? Well, I don't know. I would say that we're trapped in our culture. Our culture is what we make it, but we don't get the choice to go back in time unless some new technologies are available that I'm not aware of. But I think that even
intellectually trapped in our culture.
Well, as an artist who's making work in, now it's 2019.
Yeah,
As an artist who's making work in 2019, I live in 2019. I use materials and techniques that are available to people who work at this moment in time. Do many of them reflect an understanding of how things have been made in the past? Yes, of course they do. But they're still made utilizing techniques that are available to me now. This is Prometheus, another one of the Greek gods that I think has a lot of relevance to us at this point in time. You know, I don't do Greek mythology just because of a love affair with Greek mythology. Although I do love the stories, I think the stories have so much to say about being human and being human at a moment in time. So Prometheus is an interesting story because Prometheus is a titan. He gives fire to man, and in giving fire to man, he's punished for it. So his punishment is that he is bound to a rock and has his liver eaten out every single day. And there's something about trying, for me, that I relate to in trying to do the right thing, trying to do something that's good, sharing technology, and then being punished for it. So as a human being living in our culture at this moment in time, I feel like I'm constantly trying to do the right thing, and there are these enormous godlike forces that are just acting on me and just crushing me and tying me up and holding me down and torturing me and making my life extremely difficult.
What forces are these?
These would be just forces that anybody living in 2019 would feel like, whether it's the economy collapsing, or the price of the value of your house if you owned a house in 2009, or job insecurities, or anything that people feel. These feel like forces that are acting upon you that you have no control over. Somebody gets elected to office and all of a sudden everything in your world changes. I have nothing to do with that. So imagine Greeks thinking about gods and divinities having whatever problems they're having, and their extramarital affairs affecting like what they do to poor human beings. And I feel like that. So to me, the bound and tied Prometheus is in many ways what I feel like as a human being living in this day and age. So I'm not just choosing to work with this subject because I enjoy the story. It's because I relate to the story. So there's more to it. It was similar to when I was talking earlier about Theseus and the Minotaur. These are things that I relate to.
Of course, every culture has its problems, but not all culture has such an optimism as the Greeks had. And not every culture has such a negative view as the modern culture does.
Well, the unfortunate part, I think, about looking historically is that what we know about the Greeks is written by a handful of probably elites that had access to things. I'm sure that if you talk to the average Greek who living in, say, Athens, who made bread for a living, I'm sure he would relate in many ways, just like our culture is going to be, partially looked at, however many years in the future. They're going to look at, the movies that we leave behind, the art we leave behind, the music we leave behind, but they're not going to look at the guy who makes bread. No one's going to remember that person. So this is Pandora. Pandora, I have two different versions. One, this was the initial gesture sketch that I did of Pandora, and you can see her sort of like this. So little tiny 1/6 scale sketch, later cast in bronze. This is actually an edition of 25 that we're doing of those. And then I'm also scaling that up at the same time. So this is a work in progress in clay. And this is at 1/3 scale. So you can see that at the larger scale, we're getting a little bit more detail. The musculature and the anatomy is a little bit more accurate in ways that the smaller one doesn't have the opportunity to be. And so this is the challenge as you go up is that the challenge is to maintain the emotion that goes along with the gesture. So with the smaller gesture sketches, they tend to be so much more energetic and alive because they're small. And then when you go up, there's a tendency for sculpture to get a little bit more stale as it gets larger. And for me, this is why I work in multiple scales, is that the smaller version helps me to maintain that vitality in the larger version. So
why Pandora? What does Pandora have to tell us?
So this is one that started as the sketch. And the model sitting on the box reminded me of this sort of forlorn kind of figure. Of course, Pandora is another one. She's punished with her by being tormented for unleashing evils upon the world. And I think that as human beings, we have so many emotions and we feel so many things. We feel like these big giant forces that we can't fully understand, and so she's tormented by that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Sure.
And the pose is beautiful. So,
what else would you like to show us?
This is Artemis. It's actually, the title is going to eventually become Artemis 1 because I'm working on a second version of Artemis. But this is Artemis, she's cast in bronze. And for me, so Artemis is, of course, sort of, sits on the side of a river, hanging out with her hound dogs and lounging in the nude. The story, as this part of this story, is that a hunter comes along and sees her in the nude, and as punishment, she transforms. There are various versions, but she basically transforms him into a stag, and then has her dogs devour him. So the punishment, sort of, for seeing her in this way.
What do you think that symbolizes? What do you think that symbolizes?
Well, I don't know. I kind of almost sort of, I prefer some of these things, to leave them a little bit up to how other people maybe want to interpret that. For me, I'm just sort of interpreting the story. If you notice, as with Theseus, which I talked about before, I like to bring in some contemporary elements. So again, if I was picturing Artemis, she's usually pictured are shown with the dog and a bow.
Yeah.
But in my version, she has a .45 caliber handgun.
A little startling.
Yeah. But at the same time, it makes it now. If you put it with a bow, it seems historical. It seems Greek. It seems like it should be in a museum. You put her with a .45 caliber handgun, and all of a sudden, it's like, wow, that's right here and now. So this one is actually quarter scale, and if you take a look in the back, you can see I have a life-size version of that going up at the same time. So we're taking this up in scale, and I think that startling feeling that you mentioned of seeing her with the handgun at this small scale is going to be 10 times more dynamic, or 10 times more when you see her at life size like that. Pretty much everything that is in the studio was at one point in time modeled in clay. So the clay that I use is an oil-based clay, so it doesn't need to be wrapped up and covered. It's a harder clay. It takes details and things better, but it's harder to work with. Oil-based clay is a combination of traditional clay mixed with oils and waxes. So it's very temperature sensitive. So everything first is modeled in clay. So this was all made by hand using just various clay modeling tools and my fingers. And then from there we make a mold. So this is the actual mold for Ronnie.
What is that made out of?
So this is silicone mold rubber, and so if you kind of look inside, you can basically see what his face looks like in there. This is sealed up, and then you can put the mold back together. Top goes on like this, etc. It gets all bolted together, and then you can pour various liquids into it. Once you are done with that, you can then demold it, and you get an exact copy of what you had. So clay, mold, casting. A couple other things about the Ronnie is part of my annual Veterans Project. So for the past few years, as a veteran myself, I wanted to give back in a slightly different way. So every year I select a veteran, and then I do a portrait bust of them. And then on Veterans Day, instead of going to a parade, we have a party at the studio, and I present the first casting to the veteran. That person gets to keep that. We are actively looking for a veteran for 2019, so if people want to make nominations, they can head over to my website, and there's a nomination form. So.
That's a heroic nose he has.
No? Well, and that's what he looks like. This whole project is called Faces Tell Stories, and with the portraits, what I'm trying to do is show the stories that are sort of through the topography of the face, the stories that veterans have to tell. In terms of talking about my process and how I make things, I always work from models. So here you can see the original gesture sketch that I did for the Fisherman's Monument. The larger third scale maquette of this piece is actually at the Seamen's Bethel. If you look up here, you can see the giant squid that's on the front of the Whaling Museum, the original smaller maquette. That's an actual scaled version of the front of the Whaling Museum. So I went down and measured everything out. All math again. If we take a look over here, this is the original 1/3 scale maquette for Tom Lopes, and I used this maquette to scale up to the larger size version that's down at Tom Lopes Park in New Bedford.